Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 19, Day 37. Izuku had been somewhat lethargic. He didn't wiggle around as much or complain as much when the nurses had to do a diaper change. He would still turn his head toward him when Hisashi spoke, still seemed to perk up, but didn't open his eyes when doing so, and he wasn't nearly as interested in his pacifier as he usually was. Ever since Hisashi noticed Izuku's odd behavior, he had felt a rock start to form in his gut. Something was wrong. But, well, Hisashi was known as something of a worrywart when it came to Izuku, and he didn't want to bring up something as baseless as a bad feeling. When it might cause Izuku undue stress or additional tests, it would likely resolve itself. Hopefully. "Good morning, Midoriya-san," Anda said cheerfully as she walked in. Hisashi nodded in greeting, feeling a little subdued this morning. The rock in his gut weighed heavy, but he kept his silence. It would be fine. "Do you want to help out today?" she asked as she started checking Izuku over. Hisashi blinked at her. The honest answer was no. Not because he didn't want to be a part of Izuku's care. He did. He just had a bad feeling. "Sure," Hisashi said, folding his hands in his lap. It would be fine, he was certain. Anda grinned. "Wonderful. You're going to change his diaper today." Hisashi fidgeted with the edge of his sleeves. He resisted the urge to show any other sign of anxiety. Was this really safe? He wasn't sure. No, it was fine. Anda wouldn't have offered if she didn't think he was prepared. Everything was fine. "All right," he said softly, getting up from his chair to wash his hands and stand beside her. "Let's wake him up and tell him what's going on," Anda said. Hisashi nodded, opening the incubator portholes and reaching in. He let his hands rest next to Izuku as he gathered himself. He stared at his son, lips thinned. Izuku didn't stare back. His eyes were closed. He was sleeping, which was normal, but the rock in his gut grew. He was so still. Something was wrong. Hisashi clenched his fist, turned on the steady hands quirk, then gently cupped Izuku's head and feet. Izuku whined, his face scrunching up unhappily. "Good morning, Izuku," Hisashi said softly. "Dad's going to change your diaper, okay?" Izuku whined again, his arms pushing against his swaddling, and his feet pushing against Hisashi's hands. "Fussy today, isn't he?" Anda said, her voice a little less cheerful than before. Hisashi hummed, letting Izuku push him away. He curled his hands into fists again, watching Izuku as Anda bustled around. He could feel his unsteadiness pushing against the constraints of the quirk. The rock in his gut felt like a boulder now. Yet he could not place what was bothering him. Everything was fine. Something was wrong. "Well, fussy potato or no, we still gotta change his diaper," Anda said, coming back. She slipped him a clean diaper through one of the portholes. "We're gonna put this clean one underneath him before we do anything else. Keeps messes contained." Hisashi nodded, grabbing the diaper. He'd gone up a diaper size. The first ones had been barely larger than a credit card. This one was bigger, not by much. He unfolded the diaper, then paused. "You're going to grab his legs and lift him up, gently, just high enough to get it under him," Anda said. "Oh," Hisashi said. There was a ringing starting up in his ears. He stared at Izuku's tiny feet, watching his son spread his tiny pink toes. He thought of the last fight he had been in, and how solid stone and bone had crunched and turned to dust underneath his fingertips. Why was this bothering him again? Why was the unsteadiness pushing so hard against the quirk? Why did it feel like this rock in his gut was going to crush him? He'd picked up Izuku before. He'd even held Izuku before, all without incident. He could do this. Hisashi took a deep breath and forced his hand into motion. He faltered when he saw that his hand was shaking. Why was he shaking so badly that even the steady hands quirk couldn't contain it? Everything was fine. Something was wrong. He pushed forward anyway, wrapping his hand oh so carefully around Izuku's legs and lifting him up. Izuku cried, arms pushing even harder against his swaddle. "He's okay," Anda reassured, and Hisashi swallowed hard. He quickly slid the clean diaper underneath his baby and let him down gently. "I'm sorry, Izuku," he whispered. "He may not like it, but it's got to be done," Anda said, patting his back. Hisashi resisted the urge to flinch only just. "All right, now we can take the old diaper off," Unlatch the sides, fold them against the dirty diaper to make sure it doesn't stick to anything, and we'll see what we've got to clean up." Hisashi nodded, biting the inside of his cheek as his traitorous shaking hands fumbled against his crying baby's sides. Finally, he got a hold of it and pulled open the dirty diaper. Hisashi's stomach dropped out of his body, leaving a freezing void in his core. Ice splintered up his spine. A noose tightened itself around his neck, and his voice faded into the ringing in his ears. He couldn't breathe, because in there, in Izuku's tiny diaper, was blood. Necrotizing enterocolitis, or NEC, common only in premature infants. It was characterized by severe inflammation of portions or all of the intestines and could sometimes lead to perforation or tissue death. The mortality rate could range from 10% all the way up to 50%. Those that survive often suffered complications. He was going back on IV nutrition, antibiotics, supportive care, other, more invasive options. His son's intestines were rotting inside his body. Hisashi sat hunched over in his chair, head in his hands. He'd been reading about NEC. He shouldn't have. His throat had a barbed wire noose around it. Pulled tight against his skin, he was sweating even though the room felt like the inside of a freezer. Was Izuku cold? No, he was fine. He had to be fine. He was in his incubator, nice and warm. Hisashi ran a hand down his face, staring ahead blankly. His mind was full of static. Buzzing, half-formed thoughts and feelings blitzed around his brain at an overwhelming intensity. Pushing past them felt. He had to do something. Izuku was desperately ill, again, and he had to do something. Garaki would not be able to help. He was in prison, though it wouldn't be impossible to break him out, but he likely would not have been able to save Izuku anyway, not in a way that mattered. He wanted his son alive, not as an eternally undead infant, unable to grow or thrive or become his own person. The quirks he had were not an option. He'd gone through them all, every single one, multiple times, and absolutely none of them were safe enough to use on Izuku. How was it that out of thousands of quirks he had nothing, absolutely nothing safe enough? Why had he never thought to get even one or two quirks to help someone other than himself? Stupid, short-sighted, selfish. This was why Yoichi had hated him. He'd surely been able to see something deeply broken in Hisashi, something that he'd never even seen in himself. In all his decades, he had never bothered to think of anyone else, for even a single moment. He wasn't fit to be Izuku's father. He hadn't been fit to be Inko's husband. This wasn't fair. It should have been him, not Inko, that had died. Inko would have been the better parent. Inko would have made sure that... No, he couldn't spiral like this. He needed a plan. He needed contingencies. There had to be something he could do. He could go find some other quirk that might be able to help, but for that, he would have to leave. He couldn't do that either. Did he have any other contacts in healthcare, pediatrics? He was certain he did, but would they be better than Tanima? No, they wouldn't. There was nothing he could do. Absolutely nothing. Useless. He felt sick. Was he sick? Was this his fault? What if he had held him wrong? What if he had stressed Izuku out somehow? Had he touched Izuku without washing his hands at some point? Did Izuku get this disease, this deadly infection, this hideous rot from him? Hisashi put his head in his hands, fingers gripping his hair tightly. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest. It was becoming hard to breathe. The pain was grounding, but... Was there something wrong with his milk? No, Mitsuki's milk was the best option Izuku had. Inko was gone, and it wasn't like he could provide that, though there was probably a quirk for that. Yet another quirk he didn't have because he was utterly useless to his son. Had the staff mistreated him? No, he had never sensed any malice from them toward him or Izuku, not the doctors, not the nurses, not even the janitorial staff. If anything, he'd felt nothing but the opposite. He had never sensed that they were giving anything but their all for Izuku. Was it All Might's fault? No. If it had been, Izuku would have contracted this soon after All Might made him cry, not nearly a month later. There was no one else but him. Hisashi was the one that spent the most time around Izuku. He felt like the rot in Izuku's gut was spreading to him, infecting his insides and liquefying them to pure molten magma. Nausea swirled inside, as if he could vomit up the rot. He barely resisted the urge to gag. It had to be his fault. It had to be. But how? Had he slipped? Had he gotten lazy? Hisashi knew he was an intimidating man. Had his mere presence stressed Izuku out to this point? But he had been doing so well for so long. He had done his best, his very best, he really had. Where had he gone wrong? Midoriya-san. Hisashi gasped, sucking air down into his failing lungs. He took his head out of his hands and clasped them in his lap, staring at them blankly. Fine, he pushed out. I'm fine. He didn't even know who he was talking to. Footsteps grew closer. Hisashi wrung his hands. He'd never done that before. But he'd never felt this bad before. He made an attempt to still them, to keep up appearances, but then he belatedly realized that if he did that, he would reveal how much he was shaking, so he didn't. He turned on the steady hands quirk, but just like this morning, it failed him. Useless. Useless. The footsteps stopped. Hisashi didn't look up. He recognized Anda's shoes. I don't think you are. He woke with a nightmare on his heels, shooting upright on the couch. Outside, a storm raged. Rain pelted the windows of Inko's small apartment. A thunder rumbled like a beast, hungry for victims. Inko had insisted he stay the night after the storm truly got started. He was glad to avoid getting soaked, but his nightmares had bad timing. Hisashi groaned, putting his head in his hands. Damn vestiges. It was fine. He was fine. They were below him. He was above feeling something as lowly as guilt. Hisashi? Inko asked sleepily, walking out of her room. Hisashi jumped. I'm fine, Hisashi said quickly, rubbing a hand through his hair. She stared at him, sleepy green eyes narrowing. I don't think you are. Inko, really, I'm fine, Hisashi said, trying to laugh it off. She walked over, kneeling on the ground to be at his eye level. She put a hand on his cheek, guiding his face to look at her. She smiled gently. Her eyes held no trickery, no deceit, just concern. His laughter drained away. His smile faded. His heart skipped a beat for the first time. Do you want to talk about it? She asked softly, her thumb rubbing his cheek. Hisashi swallowed. He felt small, somehow. Inko wasn't expecting anything now, but if he refused to give her what she wanted... No, he said eventually. Inko nodded, and nothing about her changed. There was no disappointment, no anger, no frustration, just concern and understanding. Something shifted in his heart, a small click, like a door cautiously opening after an eternity of being locked tight. Hisashi said nothing. Anda and they were very similar. She would see through his words in an instant. I won't make you talk if you don't want to, Anda said. Hisashi continued to stare at his hands. But know that this isn't your fault. No one knows what causes NEC. You've been nothing but a source of comfort for Izuku. Hisashi looked away. He doubted that. If you had been a source of stress, Anda pointed out, then he wouldn't have played your voice as often as he could. He would have stopped, but he didn't, did he? The machine plays Inko's voice, too, Hisashi said numbly. It does, Anda agreed. And he still played your voice just as much as hers. Hisashi had nothing to say to that. Do you remember when I said that Izuku had spark? Anda asked. Yes, Hisashi said. I don't tell that to just anyone, Anda said softly. Because not every baby has it. Have a little faith in him, okay? What good would faith do? It was just another one of those meaningless morals Yoichi had held so dear, they always fell apart in the face of reality. His faith in Izuku would do nothing to strengthen him, nor would his faith in anything else. Having faith in him, or believing in him, were nothing but meaningless platitudes to make Hisashi feel better about the miserable position he was stuck in. Watching his son die. Watching life's work fall to ruin, all for nothing. He could argue the point with her, but why? It wouldn't make him feel any better. Okay, Hisashi said quietly. Anda patted his shoulder and left. Then there was no one but Hisashi, his dying baby, and the weight of his failures on his shoulders. He is somewhere that defies all description. It does not exist, but it goes on forever. There's no sky, but hungry lines forever crawl and run and blitz above. There's no ground, but he is still and steady. There is no one here, but eyes stare at him. There is no one here but him and his ghosts. The horde stares at him, hateful, angry, sorrowful, despairing, worshipping, apathetic, curious. Normally they are loud, but they are quiet now. He looks around. The eyes meet his, but they say nothing. He has no body here, yet he feels cold. He towers above them, yet he feels small. He is surrounded by his ghosts, yet he feels alone. Then the horde shifts. A path clears before him, just wide enough for him to walk, just small enough to feel uncomfortable. A blue light spills onto the path. A blue light outlines the ghosts. A blue light catches his eye. Izuku, he thinks. He walks forward. Did he become jaundiced again? That's what the blue light is for. The path never seems to end. He walks, but the incubator never becomes closer. He jogs, but it only gets smaller. He runs, but it is just a speck. Then he's there, looking down, but his son isn't there. He blinks. The incubator is gone. Now it's a coffin the size of a doll box. Flowers surround it. They melt as he looks on. A familiar voice clears their throat. He looks up. Yoichi looks back. His brother is covered in blood. His bright green eyes are dull and unseeing. His son is in his arms, blue, still, silent. It's better for him to be with me than with you. Izashi scrambled out of the hospital bed, choking on vomit. He was next to Izuku's incubator before he fully registered that he was awake. Izuku's chest rose and fell. His skin was a healthy pink if he ignored his swollen stomach. Izashi stared at his son, gasping, his hands pressed to the plastic walls of the incubator. The heart monitor beeped steadily. He bowed his head over the vault his son was kept in, the one Izashi was locked out of. He couldn't go back to sleep. He couldn't leave. All right, listeners, this concludes Day 37 of All For You. Day 38 will be next. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.